Hello there, friends. I'm getting a lot of questions lately about assumptions on VA loans. So I want to shoot this quick video to talk about VA loan assumptions, exactly how they work, and whether or not it is right for you. So, as we know, the market has been going up, and so VA loan assumptions are suddenly a hot thing, a hot topic. And here's a little bit about them. First of all, what is a VA loan assumption? So, assumption is where the home buyer takes over the payments for the VA mortgage loan instead of a new one being issued. And so, some things to keep in mind on VA loan assumptions is that you're simply taking over payments. So, whatever term is left on the old loan, that is what you'll have on the new loan. So, for example, if the seller took out a 30-year mortgage, they are 25 years into it at 2.5%, just say for the sake of example, then you would have the new mortgage at 2.5%. Pretty cool, right? But there are some disadvantages you need to be aware of as well. We can go through those in just a minute. So assumptions are actually part of the VA handbook. And so they are required on VA loans. And so here it is in Chapter 5, Part 7 of the VA handbook. It says the VA assumption clause must be included in the deed, conveying the property to the purchaser, and tells a little more about exactly how to do those assumptions. So it's something required by VA loans, and every VA loan has that, which is really cool. But there are some things to keep in mind as well on the assumption per the VA handbook, again, the same chapter. And the loan must be current or will be brought current at closing. Prospective purchase of the property must be creditworthy, and they have agreed to assume all loan obligations. They also do have to requalify, which is actually in the next section of the handbook. So good to know, right? So loans can be assumed. Sounds pretty good. So there are some advantages and some disadvantages of assumptions. So let's talk first about, well, before we go into advantages, though, let's talk about who can assume a VA mortgage, because it's kind of important to understand this. So who can assume it? Anyone can assume a VA mortgage, but the entitlement stays with the seller if the buyer is not VA eligible. So what the heck does that mean? So if you're going veteran to veteran, pretty easy. The entitlement just transfers over. So when you get a VA mortgage, your entitlement is charged, and it limits how many VA loans you can get. So it's a whole different discussion. So, for example, if you have, and you can't have multiple VA loans at the same time, but if you're over the Fannie Mae limit, it's a little bit over 700,000 right now here in Ohio, and you're trying to buy another house on the VA loan at the same time, you might have a down payment. So where this comes into play on assumptions is, well, first of all, if you go veteran to veteran, so it'll simply, the entitlement transfers everything to veteran. Pretty simple. If you go veteran to civilian, then that entitlement stays with the seller, and that could affect how much they can get at zero down on the new house. So say someone has a house at 400,000, they're getting assumed, and then they want to go buy another house at another 400,000. Well, in that case, they're over the Fannie Mae limit for Ohio. And in that case, they would have a down payment due on the next property, which they might or might not want to do. So that's definitely something that they have to consider when they are doing an assumption with a non-veteran. So let's talk a bit about advantages and disadvantages of assumptions. So some advantages: lower interest rate. That's a very good advantage of an assumption, because rates have been lower. Well, these are advantages for the buyer, I should say. The rates were lower 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, so definitely lower interest rate's a big advantage. The lower closing costs. The closing costs on an assumption are simply a funding fee of 0.5%, which normally 2.5% to 3.6%, and a processing fee. It ranges $250 to $300 depending on what type of lender it is. A whole different discussion. But title, appraisal, all that stuff, so it's way cheaper. And that funding fee can still be waived. As you might know, if the veteran is VA disability eligible, then that funding fee can be waived. And so that also applies in the assumption. The other thing to keep in mind is if it's a divorce situation where it's simply the veteran and the ex are doing the assumption to get one party off the loan, then there is actually not a funding fee because it's technically the same loan. So there's actually not a funding fee on that, which is really cool. Other advantages of the assumption is Oh, and then some advantages. Um, the advantages of the seller is it may add buyers that might not otherwise buy the house. So that's pretty cool too. That, as a seller of a property, if you're doing an assumption, you might be able to find some new buyers because you can put this loan is assumable. Assume my 2.5% mortgage on your Zillow, whatever, your Zillow listing, and you might find buyers who go, "Ooh, that looks kind of cool. I'm going to buy that house instead of this other house." And so, definitely, as a seller, you want to keep that in mind because you just never know. And some other so now let's go into disadvantages of assumptions. So the first disadvantage is you must use the original lender. So that's a huge disadvantage of assumptions. Is you can't just go to anybody. You have to use the original lender. It's the exact same loan because it's not a new loan. You are simply assuming the old loan. So huge disadvantage there for sure. Next disadvantage, you're going to requalify on an assumption. Excuse me. On an assumption, you actually have to do the loan process again. You have to do the application and all that stuff, and pay stubs, W-2s, all that. So in that sense, it's very similar to regular qualification. The buyer might need to bring equity closing as a down payment. That one's huge. That's actually probably one of the biggest disadvantages to an assumption. So, for example, say the house has a $400,000 loan on it, excuse me, and they are selling it for $500,000. Well, that $100,000, that seller, I mean, I guess they could sell it for just for payments, but most people want their equity, right? So in those situations, that the buyers got to figure out, well, where am I going to come up with $100,000 to make that as a down payment? Now, what they could do is go take that off of 401k, make that down payment, and then go get an equity line at closing. That's certainly one thing they can do. But they had to figure out a way to buy out that seller's equity for sure. So it's a huge disadvantage. Actually, probably one of the top ones that keeps people from doing it. And then this is a really interesting one that we've found out through our research from several people I talked to. It typically takes longer to close. Now, you may be wondering, why the heck does an assumption take longer to close? Isn't it less paperwork? And it actually is less paperwork. The problem is on the lender side that there's actually no money to be made on the lender side because there's no origination fee. There's no loan officer excited about making a commission check. So it actually takes longer to close because the lender's like, well, we're getting paid either way. We're going to get our $200 processing fee. Who cares? So yeah, they can do assumptions, but they don't like to do assumptions, and so they will drag their feet to close them, unfortunately. So that's something to keep in mind, and that's something you definitely need to discuss with your lender to find out what that turn time is going to be. But it's a huge disadvantage you got to keep in mind for sure. Oh, and also the funding fee cannot be financed. That's another one. So there's that 0.5% funding fee that I mentioned a minute ago. And on a typical VA loan, you actually can roll into the loan and borrow a little more. On an assumption, you cannot finance that. You actually have to bring that to closing if a funding fee's due. Now, if you're exempt, you don't have a funding fee. Like I mentioned a minute ago, if it's a divorce situation, it's not a funding fee. But on your typical assumption, where the veteran would have a funding fee due, then that 0.5% cannot be financed. This needs to be brought to closing. So those are your advantages and disadvantages of assumptions. I hope this answers some of your questions you have. If you have any questions about VA loans or assumptions or really anything mortgage related, feel free to give me a call. My number is 937-572-3713. I'm licensed in Ohio and several other states. I'm always more than willing to answer your questions. I can also be reached at scarpero.com. Talk to you later. Bye.